My name is Jason. I have never believed in the paranormal. It wasn't a part of my life until last summer. The house my wife Laura and I bought was perfect. Large, modern, and located in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Surveillance cameras were installed only for security. Not because of any suspicion, just for peace of mind. Nothing even close to horror movies. Until that storm started. It was one of those nights when it felt like the sky was falling on Earth. Thunder rumbled as if someone were smashing the sky with a hammer. Laura was already asleep and I stayed on the first floor checking the cameras on my laptop. The picture seemed familiar, an empty yard, paths, trees swaying in the wind. But one camera caught something that shouldn't have been there. The camera that was hanging near our garage caught some kind of shadow. At first I thought it was a reflection of a branch swaying in the wind. But when I rewinded the recording and watched it a few times, I realized, it's not a tree. It was something else. Something that was moving towards the door of our house. The camera itself suddenly made a noise and the screen went black for a few seconds. I made myself believe it was just a technical glitch due to the thunderstorm. I turned off my laptop and decided I'd better go to bed. But just then I heard a soft knock on the window. It was so quiet that you could have decided it was just raindrops. But after a second the knocking repeated, this time more distinctly. I went to the window but saw nothing. It's empty. Already in bed I could not sleep, keeping in my head that knock and that strange noise of the camera. I tossed from side to side until I fell asleep to the sound of the storm. However, another sound woke me up in the middle of the night. The living room camera started recording. I could clearly hear her soft click as she started recording through the motion sensor. But there was no one in the house except for the two of us. I jumped out of bed and rushed to my laptop. The camera only caught a brief flash of light in the dark room and the screen went black again. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. Who could it be? I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. I decided not to wake Laura, thinking it was just a fluke or a system glitch. I forced myself to calm down and went back to sleep. The next day everything looked normal. The cameras worked fine, the video was saved without any problems. I even thought that all these events were just a figment of my imagination due to the tension of the thunderstorm. But in the evening I sat down again at the laptop to check the records. And I saw him on one of the videos. The one who shouldn't have been. A figure appeared on the screen for a few seconds. It was a tall man in dark clothes. He was standing right under our door, not moving. The camera caught his face, empty, without any expression, eyes dark, like a pit. When the camera detected the movement, the image disappeared for a few seconds, and then he simply disappeared from the frame. I could not believe my eyes. A man was standing outside our house in the middle of the night in a downpour and his face looked abnormal. I felt panic tighten in my chest. I tried to find an explanation by going through the records several times, but each time I was only convinced that it was something out of the ordinary. That night I couldn't sleep anymore. Every sound made me shudder, every flash of thunder seemed like a signal for something terrible. The cameras continued to be silent, but the feeling of anxiety did not go away. I could feel something coming, something I couldn't understand. And this is just the beginning of Jason's story. What is hidden behind the camera lens? Why did the storm and strange phenomena begin to appear in their house? There will be more anxiety, fear, and mysterious events that will drive him to the edge of his mind. The next morning, I couldn't just ignore what had happened. Laura noticed that something was wrong with me. I decided to show her the video with that man. She looked at it a few times and then asked, "Did you write it down yourself? Is this a joke?" Her eyes narrowed, but I could see that she was nervous. "No, it's not a joke," I replied, feeling my throat dry. At first I also thought it was a glitch. But this man, I don't know who he is or how he ended up here. Laura thought about it and said, "Maybe we should call the police?" And what shall we say? That the camera caught a mysterious man during a thunderstorm, who disappeared after a few seconds. It will seem strange to them, but there is nothing criminal about it. She nodded silently, though I could tell she didn't like the answer. We decided to just be vigilant and watch the cameras for now. But even this plan did not bring peace. The night was drawing in and I could feel my nerves fraying. The rain had started to drizzle again, and although the thunderstorm wasn't as strong as the night before, there was still something unsettling in the air. I stayed in the living room with my laptop on my lap and checked the cameras every few minutes. Nothing unusual. Everything was quiet. Laura went up to the bedroom earlier. She was worried about what had happened the day before, but she tried not to show it. I was sitting engrossed in the screen when suddenly a camera in the backyard picked up movement. I held my breath and looked at the image. In the first frames, only trees swaying in the rain were visible. I almost breathed a sigh of relief when I noticed something in the shadows between the branches. It was a figure that barely moved, as if blending into the darkness. My hand automatically reached for the rewind key. I stared at the screen trying to figure out what it was. I suddenly realized that this figure had been standing there for several minutes, indestructible as if she was waiting for something. I rewound the tape and watched it again. Someone or something was standing in our garden just looking at the house. But why didn't the cameras work earlier? I checked the motion sensors, they were working fine. I felt the cold seep into my bones. The figure just stood there and didn't move. No signs of life or interest, just a presence. I couldn't watch any longer and turned off my laptop and rushed to the door to make sure it was locked. I also checked the windows. All were closed. Returning to my laptop, I reviewed the recording again. The figure disappeared. I don't know when it happened, but she just disappeared from the frame. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. This thing is somewhere here, somewhere very close. I couldn't sleep that night. Every now and then the cameras would turn on due to wind or rain, and each new signal made me jump up and check the recordings. But the man was no longer there. I forced myself to think that it was just a random passerby or neighbor that wandered too close to our yard. But deep down I knew it wasn't. With the next morning came a temporary feeling of relief. I decided to check the area during the day, hoping to find some tracks. I walked around the backyard, looked behind the bushes, but found nothing. No traces, not the slightest hint that anyone had been there at all. It scared me even more. Jason begins to realize that this is not just a coincidence. Something is trying to get into his life using cameras, thunderstorms, and darkness. But what is it and for what purpose? The following installments will reveal new, terrifying details of what is behind each appearance of the mysterious figure. The following days passed relatively calmly. Laura and I tried to live a normal life, but tension hung in the air. I kept checking the cameras, looking for something strange, but nothing else appeared. However, a strange feeling was growing inside me that this was just the calm before the storm. The children's room was empty. We didn't have children yet, but we still prepared this room for the future. And then, as I watched the video, something caught my eye. In the corner, near the cot, there was something, a shadow that looked like the silhouette of a child squatting. I held my breath and stopped the video. I went back to the record and tried to get a better look. At first, it seemed to me that it was just an impression of light that strangely fell on the furniture. But when I turned the recording back on, the shadow was moving slowly. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't just an illusion. Something was in the children's room, and it was not part of our home. I called Laura. She came down to the living room and I showed her the video. She looked at the screen with fear and incomprehension. "What, another trick of the camera?" she asked quietly, holding his hand. "No, y whispered. This is something else." We decided to go to the nursery together. As I approached the door, I felt a cold wave of fear pass through me. Laura took my hand and we carefully went inside. The room looked familiar, but the feeling of anxiety did not leave me. I went to the corner where the shadow was in the video, but there was nothing there. We stood in that room for a long time, trying to find at least some sign of what happened. But there was nothing suspicious. However, when I left the room, I thought I heard a soft whisper behind me. I turned around, but the room was empty. I hardly slept that night. I watched the video from the nursery several times, but each time the feeling of helplessness only increased. I started to wonder if maybe it had something to do with it that I didn't know about. Perhaps this house had its own dark history? The next day I decided to find out more about our home. I went to the local library and consulted the archives. Looking through old records, I discovered that another older and derelict house had previously stood on the site of our house. Many years ago, it was demolished after a mysterious fire in which the entire family died, including a small child. My heart sank when I read this story. The family died, but the child's body was never found. The fire destroyed almost the entire house, and they could not establish the cause of the tragedy. Local residents avoided this place, and after the demolition of the old house, no one wanted to build a new one for a long time. I couldn't put this story down. Something was bothering me. Maybe our house is not just standing on old ruins. Perhaps the energy of that family still remains here, especially of a child who has not found peace. When I got home, Laura saw my agitated look and immediately knew something was wrong. I told her everything I had learned. She looked at me with fear in her eyes, but then she whispered, Do you think this is a child? The shadow we saw in the nursery? Is that her spirit? We didn't know what to think. But something was definitely wrong. It seemed to me that that house and these strange phenomena were somehow connected. But this did not answer the main question. Why did it all start now? Why do these events coincide with thunderstorms and appear on cameras? That evening I decided not to leave the cameras unattended. I set up a permanent recording, trying to capture every movement and every sound in the house. Laura tried not to show her anxiety, but I could see how nervous she was every time lightning flashed across the room. And so, when the storm gathered again over our city, the cameras were activated again. All together. It was so sudden that I didn't even have time to prepare. Cameras recorded movement in every corner of our house. And then I saw it. All the records had the same shadow. She moved slowly through the rooms of the house as if checking who lived there. In the children's room, a small figure appeared, frozen by the bed, and in the living room, a tall silhouette stood behind the couch. My hands were shaking as I watched the video. I immediately showed it to Laura. She just stared at the screen in silence. We both understood that these were not just surveillance cameras. Something was coming to our house through these thunderstorms, and its purpose was more than just to scare us. I have made a decision. We couldn't stay here. I didn't know what we were dealing with, but I had a feeling it was something dangerous. We decided to temporarily leave the house and live in a hotel until I could find a way to deal with these phenomena. But that same evening when we were about to leave the house, something unusual happened. The cameras suddenly went off one by one. And the last thing they recorded was a soft knock on our door. What or who keeps breaking into Jason's house? Why are these forces activated now? The next installments will take you deeper into the mysterious events that unfold as Jason searches for answers to his questions. The soft knock on the door was so unexpected that we both caught our breath. I, without taking my eyes off the laptop screen, felt the cold spreading inside me. Laura looked at me with a dumb question, but I didn't know what to say to her. Who could be at the door at this time and at such a moment? We stood still for a few seconds, listening to the wind howling outside the windows and the thunder rolling across the sky. The knocking was repeated, a little louder this time, but still quiet, as if someone was shy or didn't want to attract too much attention. I slowly approached the door, peering into the eye. No one. Laura came closer and we both stopped, not knowing what to do. The knocking didn't happen again, and I began to think that it might just be the sound of a thunderstorm or a branch being blown against the door by the wind. But something stopped me, the feeling that there was something more behind it. I opened the door. There was no one at the door. I stood staring into the darkness, broken only by flashes of lightning. Everything was quiet outside except for the sounds of the thunderstorm. But when I took a step back into the house, I noticed a small piece of paper on the ground in front of the door. It was a photograph. I picked it up, and as Laura and I looked at the image, my heart sank. Our house was on the photo. More precisely, our living room, made from the inside. And a shadow standing next to the sofa was fixed on it. The same shadow I saw on the camera footage. It can't be, whispered Laura, grabbing my hand. How? How could anyone do that? I don't know, I said, trying to figure out who could have taken such a photo. And most importantly, how did this person get into our house if everything was locked? Something clearly did not fit into the logic. I had the feeling that we were facing something beyond our understanding. We have made a decision. We are leaving. Laura quickly began to gather our things, while I remained by the door, peering into the darkness of the street. Suddenly, the camera in our yard turned on again and recorded the movement. I hurried to my laptop. A picture appeared on the screen, the same figure standing right in front of the door, looking straight into the camera. But when I looked out the window, no one was there. I looked at the screen again. The figure continued to stand still, not looking away. It was impossible. How could she be on camera but not in front of the house? It seemed that the camera was not showing reality, but some parallel version of what was happening. And then the camera turned off again. Laura returned with her things. She was on the verge of panic, and I couldn't calm her down because I didn't understand what was happening. We left the house, leaving everything behind. A thunderstorm raged, as if warning us that everything was just beginning. We went to the nearest hotel. I was constantly trying to figure out what to do next. Laura hardly spoke. She was overwhelmed by everything that had happened. I felt helpless too, but I knew one thing. We can't go back to that house until we find an explanation. The next morning I contacted several paranormal experts. One of them, named Thomas, agreed to come to us and inspect the house. He was one of those people who feel the presence of the other world, and I needed his advice very much. I didn't believe in such things, but now I had no choice. Thomas arrived at our hotel a few hours later. He was a serious, elderly man who had a certain reputation in this field. I told him about all our problems, showed him the footage from the cameras and the photo we found in front of the door. He listened attentively and remained silent throughout our conversation. Then he said, "What you are facing is not just a spirit. It is something more. It is an attachment to a place, to your home. Such entities are usually activated by certain events, and perhaps something has awakened her right now." We returned to the house with Thomas. He began to walk around each room, silently exploring every corner. He stayed the longest in the children's room, staring intently at the walls, floor, and furniture. "Something tragic has happened here," he said at last. "The entity present here is restless." I told him about the story of the fire and the disappearance of the child. Thomas shook his head. "That would explain a lot," he said. "I feel that the child is the key to everything. Her spirit is attached to this place. But there is something else, something stronger, that controls this space." We started investigating this with Thomas. He believed there was a way to rid the house of this energy, but it would require a cleansing ritual to try to restore balance between the worlds of the living and the dead. He warned that it would be dangerous, but it was the only way to find out the truth. That evening, as we prepared for the ritual, I felt a strange premonition. A thunderstorm was gathering over the house again, and the cameras started flashing. I knew something was going to happen, but I had no idea how dangerous the next few hours would be. Jason and Laura face one last challenge. They will try to free the house from a mysterious entity that has taken over their home. But will they be able to survive this ritual and learn the truth? The following parts will reveal the most terrifying events that will bring them to the edge. A thunderstorm has once again covered our city, and the sky has become darker than ever. Thomas set up everything necessary for the ritual in the center of the living room. Candles, herbs, and some amulets that were supposed to protect us from what could go wrong. Laura sat next to me, squeezing my hand. Her fingers were cold, and I could feel my nerves tense with each step Thomas took. Part 58. He began the ritual. Silently speaking words in a language I did not understand, Thomas waved his hands over the candles as if trying to gather energy from the air. The cameras around us were flashing as if sensing something approaching. I stared at the laptop screen, expecting what we had seen before to appear. And then the same figure appeared on the camera again. The figure of a man stood in the darkness, but this time it did not remain motionless. She began to move slowly towards the house, approaching the door. I felt my heart speed up. "He's here," Laura whispered, looking at the screen in horror. Thomas continued the ritual, but I could see the tension on his face growing. His voice grew louder and he focused on something unseen in front of him. The candlelight flickered as if an invisible force surrounded them. Suddenly, the living room door slammed shut on its own with a deafening loud sound. Cameras inside the house showed new movement. The man's body was now in the corridor. He moved slowly but steadily toward us, and when the camera caught his face, I felt a chill in my chest. His eyes were empty, black, and it was not a human face. It was something else, something ancient and evil. Thomas stopped for a second, as if sensing a new presence in the house. "It's not just a spirit," he said, turning to face us. "This is something older. Perhaps a demon that was here before this family. He controls their souls." Suddenly, all the lights in the house went out and we were surrounded by darkness. Only the flickering of the candles allowed us to see each other. I felt something cold touch my arm and I shuddered, but only Laura was there. She was looking at me and there was panicked terror in her eyes. "We must go on," Thomas said firmly. "He wants to scare us into retreating. But if we stop now, he will win. We must finish the ritual." His words gave me confidence, but inside I felt a growing feeling that we were involved in something that we could not handle. When Thomas returned to the candles and continued the spell, strange things began to happen in the house. The wardrobes opened by themselves. The wind suddenly began to walk through the rooms, although all the windows were closed. The light flickered and I saw him again, a figure already standing at the entrance to the living room. The figure of a man was approaching. He was standing right behind Thomas, but he couldn't seem to touch him. Something kept him at bay, but I had a feeling it wasn't for long. Laura began to whisper a prayer, her words trembling in the darkness, but she did not stop. Suddenly the figure disappeared. In just a moment, I looked at the laptop screen. There was nothing on the cameras. Thomas raised his hands as he spoke the last words of the ritual, and suddenly the room was eerily quiet. The wind is gone, everything is back to normal. I couldn't believe it was over. Thomas looked exhausted. He sat down on a chair and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Is that all?" Laura asked, her voice sounding distant. "Did we win?" "I'm not sure," said Thomas. "The essence is weakened, but it is still here. We have to go back and clean this place completely." We left the house for a few days. Laura and I were exhausted after everything that had happened, but I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't the end. It seemed to me that even though we cleaned the house, something was still waiting for its time. When we returned a week later, the house was quiet, even too quiet. The cameras no longer recorded movement and everything seemed normal. But Thomas warned us that this was only a temporary lull. The entity could return at any moment if something reawakened it. We decided to live on, although the feeling that the house was still alive did not leave us. Every sound, every rustle made me shudder. But in a few weeks nothing happened and we started to go back to normal life. One evening, as usual, I checked the recordings from the cameras. There was nothing unusual. But when I fast-forwarded to a time when we weren't home, I saw this. A man's figure stood by the front door, looking directly into the camera. She did not disappear. She waited. I couldn't believe my eyes. She came back. Isn't it over? Is it possible that we just temporarily restrained her? Laura was already asleep and I didn't want to wake her up. But now I knew that the fight was not over. The next morning I told Laura what I saw on the tape. She looked depressed. Thomas had warned us that this could happen, but we hoped it was over. "What to do now?" she asked. "We can't live like this all the time in fear." I decided to contact Thomas again. He said that one more ritual could be performed, but that it would not guarantee complete purification, and he was no longer sure that he could help us any further. "I'm afraid it's more than just a spirit or a demon," he said. "It can be something that is attached to you or to this place forever." I didn't know what to do next. We couldn't sell the house. Who would buy a place where these things happen? And even if it were sold, it would not solve the problem. Something might have followed us. Jason and Laura faced a terrible truth. Their home and their lives were intertwined with the world of the afterlife. Can they find a way to free themselves from this power, or will it stay with them forever? The next parts of the story will delve into even greater fears and reveal what is really behind this curse. We decided to stay in the house no matter how scary it was. The entity could stay here, but we couldn't keep running. I felt that if we left, she would find us wherever we were. Laura supported my decision, even though I could see her fear take over every time a thunderstorm gathered over our house. Time passed and everything remained relatively calm. I continued to watch the cameras, but nothing new appeared. I did occasionally see small flashes of light or shadows in the corners of the frames, but it wasn't as obvious as before. However, the feeling that we are not alone never left me. One evening when I was alone at home, Laura went to her friend's house. The thunderstorm started suddenly as always. I was sitting in front of my laptop checking the cameras when I saw it again. The same shadow that once scared us in the children's room appeared on one of the screens. She slowly moved towards the corridor. I grabbed my phone and tried to call Laura, but the connection was bad. The wind roared outside the windows as if warning about something. I got up and slowly walked down the hall to the children's room. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt like something was pulling me there. When I opened the door to the nursery, everything seemed familiar, as if nothing had happened. I carefully approached the crib and stopped, and then I heard it whisper. Quiet, barely noticeable but clear. It was coming from somewhere behind the cot. My heart was pounding loudly in my chest. I walked around the crib and then I noticed that there was a small toy on the floor. She didn't belong to us, we never bought toys. It was an old plush doll with faded eyes, as if someone had left it here years ago. I slowly picked her up and at that moment the light in the room went out. I was left in the dark with this strange toy in my hands. I panicked. I started to back away towards the door, but it suddenly slammed shut right in front of me. I heard something moving behind me. I turned and saw a small figure in the shadows. It was a child. She stood still looking at me. Her eyes were empty, her face expressionless, and in her hands she held the same plush doll as the one I had. I couldn't move, my mind refused to believe what was happening. The figure of the child began to slowly approach. Her footsteps were silent and I felt the cold wind wash over my body. The doll in my hands suddenly fell to the floor. The moment it touched the ground, the child disappeared, leaving me standing in complete darkness and silence. The light in the room turned on again, but the child figure was gone. I stood there, not believing my eyes, and there was only an old doll lying on the floor. I grabbed her and quickly ran out of the room, closing the door behind me. It seemed to me that I had just experienced a meeting with the past, which has not yet found peace. When Laura came home, I told her everything. She was shocked, but not as shocked as before. We are used to the idea that the house has its own dark history, and that it manifests itself through these strange phenomena. What does it all mean? She asked. Why did it come back? I didn't know what to say. But something told me that this child we saw was not evil. She was just a lost soul trying to find peace. But what kept her here? Perhaps the same demonic force that Thomas spoke of. We reconnected with Thomas. He confirmed our suspicions. There's a chance it's a kid trying to show you something, he said. Her soul may be captured by the demonic entity that is keeping her here. Maybe she wants to break free but can't because of this power. We decided to keep looking for answers. Laura suggested another ritual to try to help the child. But Thomas warned us that if we interfered with it again, we might wake up what actually controls this house. And it may not let us go. We faced a difficult choice. We could try to free the child's soul, but that meant risking our lives and Laura's. Or we could leave everything as it is and try to live on, but with the feeling that something is still around. I have made a decision. We could no longer live in fear. I decided to perform the ritual regardless of the consequences. We prepared everything necessary and agreed with Thomas on the day when it would take place. The ritual was to be performed in the nursery where we saw the baby. Thomas warned us that this could be the hardest challenge, but if all went according to plan, we could rid the house of the curse. The day of the ritual has come. Laura and I stood in the children's room with Thomas, holding candles and protective items in our hands. He began to chant and the room began to fill with a strange coldness. I felt something coming. The light in the room went out again and we were left in the dark. Thomas continued the ritual, but something went wrong. Shadows began to move along the walls, and an eerie noise appeared in the air. I felt a cold breath touch my neck, and suddenly we saw her. The child appeared in the corner of the room holding the same plush doll. She was looking at us in silence, but now her face expressed pain and suffering. Laura began to cry softly, sensing her sadness. And then we heard it, a loud, menacing voice coming from the darkness. It was so deep that it went straight to the bones. "You have no power here," said the voice. "This soul belongs to me." I felt our strength leaving us. The shadows were getting thicker and it was hard to breathe. But Thomas did not stop. He raised his hands and loudly shouted the last words of the spell. And at that moment, everything stopped abruptly. Part 100. The darkness retreated, the shadows disappeared. The child stood still, but now her face was calm. She looked at us with gratitude and began to slowly dissolve into the air. Thomas fell to his knees, exhausted but alive. The house became quiet. And for the first time in a long time we felt real peace. After a long struggle, Jason and Laura finally freed the house from the demonic force and the lost soul of the child. But what happened to them next? Perhaps this story is just the beginning of their new journey, where the past always leaves a mark in our reality. The house became eerily quiet. Thomas, breathing heavily, sat on the floor, leaning against the wall. Laura helped him up, and I, exhausted as I was, felt a sudden sense of relief. The darkness that haunted us for so long is gone. But something inside me did not allow me to believe that everything was finally over. The feeling that we had only temporarily overcome this evil never left me. We spent the next few days in the house trying to get used to it being ours again. We were afraid to go back to the children's room, although we knew that the child had finally found peace. Thomas left, leaving us charms for protection and advice on what to do next. He warned us to be vigilant, because the world of the afterlife is unpredictable. We were slowly rebuilding our lives, but even the little things reminded us of what had happened. Every thunderstorm caused us anxiety. Every sound in the night made me jump out of bed and check the cameras. Although nothing else out of the ordinary appeared, I could not shake the feeling that something was still with us. One evening, while Laura was cooking dinner, I sat down at the laptop again to go through the old footage from the cameras. It became a habit to watch the footage, trying to find some pattern or explanation for what was happening. But this time I noticed something unusual about one of the earliest records. In the recording where I first saw the shadow outside the garage, between the flashes of lightning I saw something new. It was a small figure, a child, standing far away in the shadows looking at the house. It was there from the beginning, even before we noticed other phenomena. I rewinded the recording again, looking at every detail. This child appeared long before the thunderstorms and strange events inside the house began. What could it mean? Perhaps the child was seeking help from the beginning, trying to warn us of something worse. I told Laura about my findings and she just shook her head. Perhaps all this was just the beginning of something much deeper, she said. Perhaps this soul was trying to find a way out from the very beginning, but we did not understand how to help it. We continued to live in the house, although the feeling that something was still hidden did not leave us. Every day was like a test. We were constantly waiting for some entity to appear again or new phenomena to begin. But the weeks passed quietly. One evening, while we were sitting in the living room, the light suddenly began to flicker. My heart sank. I stood up and looked at the cameras. Movement was detected again in the children's room. I checked the video and it showed nothing but a faint flash in the corner of the room. It was like a faint light, as if someone was standing there with a lantern. I decided to go to kindergarten. Laura tried to talk me out of it, but I was determined to find out what was going on. I opened the nursery door and carefully went inside. It was quiet there. The crib, on which we never used bedding, was empty. But in the corner I saw again this old stuffed doll that I had thrown away after our last ritual. This doll is back again, even though I clearly remembered getting rid of it. I moved closer and bent down to pick her up, but suddenly I heard a soft whisper behind me. Turning around, I saw a child standing in the doorway. It was her. Now her face was calm and her eyes were no longer empty. She looked at me gratefully. "Have you found peace?" I asked, not believing my eyes. The child was silent, but her presence no longer caused fear. She just stood there, and the air around her became warm and quiet. The room seemed to be filled with a sense of peace. The child slowly disappeared, leaving only a faint glimmer of light. I stood there, realizing it was her parting gesture. She won't be coming back. She found a way to rest. But this feeling of peace was bittersweet, because it meant the end of something great and mysterious. When I left the nursery, Laura met me with a look of relief on her face. "What happened?" she asked. "She's gone," I said. "I think that was her last farewell. She will never come back." Laura looked confused, but her eyes shone with hope. For the first time in many months, we felt that we could start a new life without fear. We have started to put our lives together again. The house became calm, ordinary. Thunderstorms no longer caused us panic, and sounds in the night no longer seemed like a sign that something was chasing us. We started thinking about the future and maybe opening a nursery again for our own child. One day we decided to do something that we had been putting off for many months. We removed all the old things from the nursery, prepared it again, and decided to let go of the past. Laura made repairs, decorated the room, and now it looked bright and cozy. But even now that life was returning to normal, we couldn't completely forget everything that had happened. Our house has become a part of us, and with it the shadows of the past. They were no longer threatening, but their presence left a deep mark. One evening we were sitting on the porch listening to the wind rustle in the trees. Laura said quietly, "I think she really has found peace. But have you noticed that anything has changed since she left?" I thought about it. The house has become calmer, it's true. But at the same time, the feeling that there were no more invisible presences made me feel a strange sadness.